So our topic for this workshop this morning is public sector corruption. And I don't think that I need to say very much to introduce that topic. We all know how serious the problem is of corruption in almost all our countries. Definitely here where I am in South Africa, it is a most serious problem, but I think it affects everywhere in Africa. And indeed, there's no country in the world that is completely free of it. It has always been the case that civil society has an important role to play in working against corruption, holding governments accountable, making sure that the money is correctly spent and not stolen by officials and politicians. And that's part of our purpose this morning as civil society organizations, to learn more about this issue and about what we can do in civil society to work against it. Our presenter this morning is Karam Singh from the organization Corruption Watch. Unfortunately, the director of Corruption Watch, David Lewis, is unable to be with us due to illness at the moment. We send him our best wishes. David is an extremely experienced, I would say, the leading voice in anti-corruption work in civil society in our country, and has been doing this for many, many years. Karam has also been working in Corruption Watch for a very long time. He's a qualified attorney, very experienced in human rights work, social justice work. And so Karam will lead us through this seminar this morning. We are recording it. We will make the video available as usual in due course once it's been edited. And we will also make the PowerPoint presentation available for you afterwards. So the video and the presentation can both be used then as a resource in your work in your various countries. So that is where we are. I think we will be probably more or less 1 hour with the presentation. And then we will open up to the usual questions. At any time, you are free to put questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box. That's a useful way of doing it, because then we can make sure we record those questions as well. But there will be opportunity for verbal questions also. So without any further delays then, I'm going to hand over to Karam. Welcome, Karam.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that kind introduction. And good morning to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I speak with you from my home in Cape Town. We're still working remotely due to conditions relating to the pandemic. I should perhaps just acknowledge the fact that we've all been through a very difficult time dealing with the pandemic, and touched many of us. Many of my colleagues have gotten sick. We've lost loved ones, including in my family as well. And I just, every time I've been speaking publicly recently in this period, I always think it's important just to take a moment to just acknowledge what we've all been going through in this particularly challenging moment, over and above the challenges that we already had, such as the challenges we have about corruption. So I'm going to pull up my presentation and let's take it from there. Let me just see if this works. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, let me just put it in presentation mode. Just by way of a bit more background about myself, I've been with Corruption Watch since the end of 2019. Prior to that, I spent some time working with a private law firm based here in Cape Town. I'm an attorney by training. Before that, I spent many years with the South African Human Rights Commission as head of research and as manager in the Western Cape Provincial Office. And prior to that, I spent many years with an organization in South Africa called the Special Investigating Unit, also commonly known as the SIU, which is one of South Africa's leading anti-corruption agencies. And I will reference them later on in the presentation and talk a bit about them. Corruption Watch, for those of you who don't know, is a nonprofit organization. We're publicly facing, and we engage in a range of activities from the production of our own media to doing investigations, targeted research, and running campaigns, all in the aid of anti-corruption and the fight against corruption. Next year will be 10 years of Corruption Watch. It's been led over this period by David Lewis, who is now going to be stepping down soon and is in the process of retiring. It's important to note that Corruption Watch is the African chapter of Transparency International, which is an international NGO, also focused on issues in the fight against corruption, with many country offices around the African continent and a secretariat based in Germany. We've worked closely with TI on many projects, many multi-country projects, and we consider them a real partner of ours. Corruption Watch's ultimate objective includes fighting the rising tide of corruption and the abuse of public funds by promoting principles around transparency, accountability, good governance, and ethics. And I'm quite happy as the discussion goes on to provide more insights into how Corruption Watch works. It's a very, I was quite surprised when I joined Corruption Watch about the scope and depth of the work that Corruption Watch does. It's really playing an important role in civil society among many other civil society organizations in South Africa. I think despite many of the democratic challenges that South Africa faces, there are a couple of pillars of democracy which are still very much in place, supporting the South African project. Those include the Constitution, an active and independent media, and an active and independent civil society sector. Okay, let's see. Okay, sorry, just figuring out how to go through the slides. Okay, so in preparation for this presentation, Mike had sent me a number of questions, and they all relate to, well, the outline is as you see on your screen here. So I'll spend a bit of time talking about what is corruption, what are the common elements of corruption, who is responsible for corruption, the effects of corruption, what are the conditions which enable corruption, what do we see as some of the corruption trends, and then what do we understand as some of the institutional responses and civil society responses to fighting corruption. So if you were to Google corruption and look for a definition, you'd find multiple definitions of corruption. Some are more legalistic than others. The term also does find definition in various statutes and various legal documents. But fundamentally, we're talking about dishonest or unlawful illegal behavior, the abuse of public resources or public power for personal gain. And I think this is critical to the corruption definition. Our kind of conceptual understanding of corruption is this relationship between public power and private gain, and that can can manifest itself in different forms. If you look at it from a more of a morality or ethical perspective, action or effect of making someone or something morally deprived. I'm not going to go too much into the moral questions, but certainly the discussion will touch upon questions of ethics, questions of what does it mean to do the right thing, and what does it mean to be complicit in corruption by either not doing the right thing or just looking the other way or remaining silent. In terms of breaking down some of the elements, we talk about abuse of power. people in positions of power are expected to behave based upon certain levels of responsibility in relationship to their mandates, to act truthfully and to act in the best interests of the public, in the case of public officials, or in the best interests of their company, or in the best interests of their community. So you can imagine abuse of power taking place in many different types of settings. When power is abused, it means that the fundamental values are subverted and the public interest is sacrificed for private gain. So then instead of responsibility, we've got irresponsibility. Instead of truth, we have dishonesty. Instead of the public interest, we have private or personal gain. And I think, it's the abuse of power is perhaps potentially a somewhat fuzzy area. It's not always something that one can put one's finger on, and one can be engaged in practices of abusing power in a context which is not necessarily equal to unlawful or illegal conduct, but it relates to certain kinds of notions around standards. Just want to make sure I'm going through the slides properly. In terms of how corruption manifests itself, one of the major forms that we've seen over the years in South Africa has been the abuse of the public procurement system. So this is a notion of procurement irregularities, notions around embezzlement of funds or theft of resources. Some of that activity could be purely criminal, but when it involves public officials and public funds, it's squarely within the field of corruption. Notions of nepotism or cronyism, the favoring of one's family or friends, the abuse of one's position to favor one's family and friends. Bribery. Bribery is kind of a classic corruption offense that involves a private official, a public official and a private person or a private organization where money is passed from those private persons to public officials in order to gain some type of benefit. When corrupt activities happen, we then see that the proceeds of the crime gets laundered, this notion of money laundering. There's a further initial concept called illicit financial flows. This is the way money flows from the public purse into private hands and then gets dissipated into other private accounts and often then gets taken offshore. We know that this notion of offshore tax havens, many of the island countries around the world that don't have a lot of scrutiny around their banking legislation. Historically, Switzerland was a place where people used to launder their money, but we often hear about the Cayman Islands and other kind of far-flung destinations. A lot of this information came out in various information leaks that you may recall, such as the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. This notion of fraud, which is a basic criminal offense, but again, when it involves the interface of public and private officials, we see it as a form of corruption. And then this notion of maladministration, which I've put in a parenthetical. And maladministration is basically, again, another kind of gray area where government isn't doing what it's meant to be doing. So in the context of education, teaching is not happening in the classroom. Facilities that are meant to be built, such as clinics, such as public toilets, are not built. The money gets squandered. This could be for a variety of reasons due to just poor performance or lack of capacity, or it could very much be related to corruption. So there is this kind of gray area, which is the catch-all phrase is is maladministration. When I worked for the Special Investigating Unit, the Special Investigating Unit had a mandate to investigate corruption, maladministration, and fraud. So in terms of the mandate, the legal mandate provided to the SIU, corruption, fraud, and maladministration were seen as three distinct categories, but clearly they're interrelated. In terms of corruption, what we see is that the same set of events can often lead to multiple interrelated forms of corruption. So going back to this list, you often see different elements of these, of what I'm identifying: procurement irregularities, nepotism, bribery, and then money laundering, all in the same set of transactions. So we've seen this in what's come to be known as the fish rot case in Namibia. My disclosure here is that I'm not an expert on the fish rot case, but I did know that we had some colleagues from Namibia who are supposed to be on this workshop, and perhaps they can share more about this. And then this notion in South Africa around state capture. And I'll speak a bit more about state capture as the presentation goes on. State capture used to be closely aligned to a notion called grand corruption. This is now distinct from a notion of petty corruption. Grand corruption is the ways in which at the senior levels of the state, systems get captured, get diverted, again for private benefit, for the benefit of private individuals, such that state institutions don't fulfill their mandate, and therefore they're actually weakened and eroded in the process. And you may be aware that there's been a 3-year-long judicial commission of inquiry taking place in South Africa into this notion of state capture, which again I'll speak to a little bit later in the presentation, also known as the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. So just looking briefly at the fish rot case, it involved an Icelandic fishing company with a branch in Namibia. It took place over a 6-year period between 2012 and 2018, where this company was able to access Namibian fishing quotas by paying over $10 million in bribes to politicians and businessmen. The bribes were paid in various forms by way of rents, consulting fees, and the money was channeled through various banks inside and outside of Namibia. This Icelandic fishing company also moved profits out of their country in order to evade taxes and to launder their money. And I think tax evasion also is could be understood as a headline corruption activity. To navigate fishing quotas in Namibia, one had to go through the so-called sharks. These were now various officials that were involved, were implicated in this activities, including the fisheries minister, the minister of justice, various relatives of these ministers, officials from banks, and various investment administrators. So there was kind of a network of various corrupt actors involved at the level of the state. The Icelandic company used Cyprus, the UK, Mauritius, Dubai, Norway, and Namibia and Poland as role players or waypoints for their money that eventually ended up in private bank accounts. Many of these areas were, again, as I've noted, were sort of seen as tax havens. But it's notable that not all of these countries are deemed to be traditionally be corrupt. Norway and the UK in particular have always sort of stood by strong kind of anti-corruption policies and legislation. The bank in Norway led some credibility to the transactions and helped to enable them, and money was illegitimately transferred out of Namibia. The Financial Intelligence Center in Namibia flagged around $650 million worth of suspicious transactions connected with this scandal. The story, importantly, came to light through a whistleblower who was a former managing director of the Namibian branch of the Icelandic fishing company. He became suspicious, and then he left the company with over 30,000 incriminating digital documents, which he handed over to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks then shared the documents with Al Jazeera, which then later made them public, allowing public interest entities like Finance Uncovered to analyze them. I think through the presentation, you'll hear this notion of whistleblowers and whistleblowing. Whistleblowers ultimately are people that find themselves in the system, often compromised, who then report corruption. They oftentimes, because of lack of trust with the police, they don't report the corruption directly to law enforcement, but they leak the documents in the media. And then this ultimately then leads to greater exposure and investigations. If we look at the big corruption scandals which have taken place in South Africa, in almost each case, you can identify a key whistleblower that was responsible for sharing information. And I think it's important to note that whistleblowers are often victimized. They're often subjected to what you call occupational detriment, where they are then disciplined by their companies for contravening confidentiality policies or privacy policies. It's important to note that such policies, should never be used to then cover up issues around criminality. So whistleblowers often find themselves out in the cold. They often lose their jobs. They often find themselves unemployable. And when we think about issues around how we enhance our fight against corruption, we need to think very squarely around this issue around how we treat whistleblowers and what a robust whistleblower protection system could look like. At the moment in South Africa, we have something called the Protected Disclosures Act, which is a good piece of legislation, but it's not clear that it does enough to sufficiently protect whistleblowers who find themselves in very vulnerable situations. So just looking at issues around procurement, in many countries, particularly in South Africa, the state is one of the most significant actors within the economy. If you sort of take state activity out of the economy which is already not providing enough for the population would be even smaller. So the acquisition of goods and services by government is a huge, it's a huge part of the economy. It's a huge business. And it's really been a place where corrupt actors have sought to kind of target the system and to target weak systems. By weak systems, I mean systems which are vulnerable to corruption, to divert a budget which is put forth for procurement for individual and private gain. So when there are any number of kinds of irregularities which can take place in procurement. One of the big things that happened is this notion of kind of fronting, where there's the appearance of one set of actors who are procuring for services, but there's actually another set of actors behind them. And in some cases, those are public officials. These other issues that we've spoken about in terms of cronyism, in terms of bribery, all of that takes place in the procurement context. I think in South Africa, at least, procurement has been identified as South Africa's #1 procurement risk. And as I've noted, it involves irregular tenders, frauds, and other forms of procurement. In South Africa, there's a process underway to reform the public procurement system. At the moment, we have something called the PFMA, the Public Finance Management Act. And there's a new piece of legislation which was introduced last year by National Treasury, by the Ministry of Finance, called the Public Procurement Act, which would then look to reform procurement and to try to strengthen the system. One of the big challenges we find in procurement is the lack of transparency. So the inability, certainly within the state, but even greater so within civil society, to monitor how procurement is taking place, to be able to identify potential irregularities, what we would call red flags in procurement investigations. What we've been advocating for, and we've been working very closely with another outfit called the Open Contracting Partnership, is for greater transparency in the area of procurement, such that a procurement can be monitored and that irregular procurement can be picked up earlier before the money is stolen and dissipated in various accounts. Last year, South Africa had a big, significant scandal around the procurement of personal protective equipment, PPE, related to, in response to the pandemic. This led to an investigation by the Special Investigating Unit, and the irregular procurement that was identified, the contracts under investigations, went into the tens of billions of rands of contracts. In that moment, National Treasury had put emergency procedures in place to regulate procurement so that it would make it easier to procure certain goods. And that those emergency procurement measures that were put in place were ultimately what the corrupt actors seized upon to be able to engage in procurement fraud. Other examples of procurement fraud, I've spoken about the PPE corruption. The Eskom, which is the energy producer in South Africa, hundreds of billions of rand worth of irregular tenders. And this involved irregularities in the production of new power stations. The last bullet there is this thing called the Digital Vibes tender. This is now a story which was broken by an investigative journalist. It involved a contract awarded by the Department of Health to a private communications company to do strategic communications around a new program in South Africa related to national health insurance, NHI. The contract was awarded to friends, cronies of the then Minister of Health. And again, we saw this pattern of money going into one bank account and then being dissipated into other bank accounts. There's been an investigation into the matter. There's been a report which has been submitted to the president. It hasn't been made public yet, but the Minister of Health stepped aside and then ultimately resigned, or pleading his innocence along the way. But it was certainly notable because in the South African context, we haven't seen very many ministers step aside when they've been implicated in corruption. So there was some accountability related to this matter, but there's still more to come in relationship to that Digital Vibes matter. Okay. I've spoken about embezzlement of funds, theft of resources. I think this is something which most people probably have a good understanding of. The crime of secretly taking money that is in one's trust and that belongs to an organization or business one works for. This often occurs via racketeering, which involves the use of organized crime in which the perpetrators set up fraudulent or otherwise illegal coordinated schemes or operations to repeatedly and consistently collect money or other profits. And in the context of state capture in South Africa, we've seen that kind of syndicated, organized criminal activity linked to the theft of public resources. Examples of this in the South African context, there was something called the VBS Mutual Bank, which was a kind of public-private partnership in this bank where significant amounts of funds, including the savings of pensioners and others, was looted. The investigation into this matter unfolded quite quickly, due to a key official at the bank that turned state witness and has given testimony implicating others. There's also another quite prominent matter called the Estina Dairy Farm, which was in the Free State, which implicated the Secretary General of the African National Congress, who's now facing corruption charges and has been forced to step aside from his position as Secretary General. And that's also a matter which has received a lot of attention in terms of the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. Nepotism or cronyism, this relates to the unfair practice by a powerful person of using their influence to give jobs and other favors to relatives, nepotism or friends or associates. This is a form of corruption that's often excused as just a form of networking. We've seen key institutions in South Africa riddled with this kind of nepotism, including crime intelligence. You'll note the image in this slide of former President Jacob Zuma and Duduzane Zuma, who was very good friends with the so-called Gupta brothers who were involved in the state capture project. This interesting notion in South Africa that that we have a free market society and that there shouldn't be any restrictions on people's ability to get involved in business and to get rich. And in other jurisdictions, because of the challenges around cronyism, they've developed this notion around politically exposed persons, and then the establishment of new rules or prohibitions around politically exposed persons being allowed to do business with governments. So this would include spouses, this would include family members, this would include other close associates. And at the moment, it's not a kind of legislation that we currently have in South Africa, but I think as we sharpen our fight against corruption, we may want to look at this notion of politically exposed persons. And we may also want to revisit this notion around how the free market functions and whether we think it's acceptable for those who are close to power and close to influence to be able to leverage that proximity for their own private gain. And I think there may be some personal freedoms and liberties which we may need to sacrifice in order to ensure that we have a more robust anti-corruption regime in place to shut some of this down. It's also worth noting that the nepotism was a big part of the fish rot scandal. Bribery, I think we do understand what bribery is. It's an act of offering someone money or something of value in order to persuade them to do something for you. Bribing an official to receive a tender. Again, this was a big part of the fish rot scandal. And this is something which we see sort of in everyday corruption. It's something that we see in so-called petty corruption. So, petty corruption would be, again, in the South African context, and excuse me for relying so much on South African examples, but, the classic example is being pulled over by a traffic official for a road violation, speeding or going through a stop sign or some other kind of moving violation. And then the police officer says, well, give me 100 Rand, help me go buy a soft drink, a soda drink, and then, I won't give you a ticket. So, we do see that kind of bribery in the petty corruption context. The other, example would be going into the Department of Home Affairs to receive an identity document and being told that you don't qualify to receive that identity document because you can't prove where you were born, or you don't have any proof of your identity. And then you're able to pay a fee in order to get that document. So, these are kind of everyday forms of corruption. And there was a big debate in South Africa about 10 years ago about whether corruption was endemic to South African society, meaning that it was interwoven into the very fabric of how we do things. Now, I would understand a notion of endemic corruption to mean that almost any interface between an individual and a public official, whether it is to get a business permit, or as I said, some kind of identity permit, would involve some type of illicit transaction of bribery. That, that to me would be endemic corruption. You can also think about endemic corruption in that grand corruption space where institutions of state are diverted from what they're meant to do, that there's big theft, of kind of hundreds of millions of rand. I think, an argument can be made that we have moved towards more of an endemic corruption, but it's not clear to me that if you go in and out of every single municipality in South Africa, that every single transaction involves an illicit payment. I don't think that we're there yet, but if we don't strengthen our enforcement and our general approach to our fight against corruption, that could be the direction that we go. And then again, just to emphasize this notion of money laundering, this is kind of the process whereby money is then flows out into different bank accounts, into different jurisdictions. It's not reported to the taxman, so therefore the money is not taxed. It's facilitated by banks. It's facilitated by other financial handlers. And the real challenge in the fight against corruption is that if we had stronger preventative measures in place, then we could kind of potentially shut some of this down. But the reality that what we're seeing is that once the money is stolen, it's very difficult to recover that money because of the way in which it's dispersed, because of the way in which it's laundered. And of course, the other classic way of laundering money is just to spend it. So just to buy properties, to buy other kinds of expensive items. And you'll see in some jurisdictions that in response to this, they've put other mechanisms in place. So in the UK anti-bribery framework, they've got something called unexplained wealth orders. So if you're seen to sort of, you're a mid-level a public official that earns a certain amount of money, but all of a sudden you've been able to build a palatial kind of mansion. It's possible that if you had a robust anti-corruption regime, that the anti-corruption agency could come to you and hit you with an unexplained wealth order and ask you to explain how you were able to get the money to build that mansion. And that's a tool that some in law enforcement are using now. And then fraud, intentional deception to secure unlawful gain. An example that we've given here relates to the National Lotteries Commission. We've got a national lottery in South Africa. It's voluntary, people buy lottery tickets, and the National Lotteries Commission then takes these funds and is meant to provide grants to NPO, nonprofit organizations, NGOs, and we found lots of cases of fraud in this area, and it's a matter which is currently under investigation. And then back to this notion of maladministration. Again, I've put it in a parenthetical. This relates to inefficient or dishonest administration or mismanagement, failures in the provision of services, where corruption meets incompetence. So a classic example of maladministration, and I focus on this example relating to my previous work at the South African Human Rights Commission, relates to the notion of toilets in schools. So in many rural schools in South Africa, we find that there's not a proper provision of sanitation. You've got pit latrines and other forms of irregular types of ablution facilities. And there have been some quite horrific stories and even fatalities linked to the provision of pit latrine toilets. There was a famous case of a boy, quite a tragic story of a boy who fell into a pit latrine and passed away. Now, why, despite numerous promises, despite the provision of budget, don't we see the provision of proper toilets at schools across the country? Is it corruption? Or is it something short of corruption, just the inability of the system to do what it's supposed to do, this notion of maladministration? And for me, there is this direct linkages, nexus between corruption and maladministration, and then the provision of basic rights. So in the example that I've given you, you really see that the right to education, the right to a clean environment, the right to water and sanitation are fundamentally compromised when government doesn't do what it's supposed to do, and when corruption perverts the system. Responsibility for corruption. I could go over this slide very quickly and say that we all responsible for corruption, that in order to fight corruption, we need to have a total society approach. We need to have a zero tolerance approach. When we see corruption, we need to report it. But obviously there are power dynamics in place that often makes that more complicated. The classic corrupt example is that of a public official and a private person, this notion of the supply and demand of corrupt activities. I think in terms of perceptions of corruption, we see that there's a lot of focus on the police, on government officials, including members of cabinet, members of parliament, on high-ranking business people, on leaders of NGOs, and even religious leaders and other traditional leadership. So, there's a way in which leadership across the board in different examples and different cases have been implicated in issues of corruption. And as we noted in the previous case studies in the fish rot scandal and others, one corrupt transaction could involve and implicate multiple actors. One of the things that's come out quite starkly in the South African context again is the role that professionals and middlemen play, or middle people play, in facilitating corruption. This is now the role that lawyers, accountants, management consultants, people associated with the big consulting companies like McKinsey and KPMG and PricewaterhouseCoopers have been implicated in facilitating corruption through various activities, through their advisory services. And we've seen some of these companies actually paying back huge sums of money to government on the basis of the fact that they were implicated in corruption scandals. Public perceptions of corruption. I noted in the beginning that Corruption Watch is a South African chapter of Transparency International. Every 2 years, Transparency International issues a public perceptions index where they rank countries. Corruption is very difficult. It's not the process of trying to monitor and quantify corruption is not scientific. It's a secret crime. We do have stories, investigations do take place, investigative stories do come out, but in many ways we're still left with a very blunt tool in terms of public perception studies to understand the depths of corruption. And annually, you would be able to track your country to sort of see how it falls. South Africa falls sort of low table, not the most corrupt country, not the least corrupt country, but a country which is not whose score isn't really improving, and the perception of corruption in South Africa is not really improving. Many more people reported having a general suspicion of corruption towards the police, government officials, member of parliament, than towards traditional leaders, NGOs, and religious leaders. Why is there this strong perception? I believe it relates fundamentally to the erosion of trust. We have a president in South Africa that talks a lot about social compacting, this notion of kind of a partnership between government, the private sector, and civil society fundamentally, those kinds of partnerships are based upon notions of trust. And what we find is that trust is really has fundamentally been eroded, also to the extent that people distrust the police and distrust that when they report corruption, that there will be an investigation and that their identities would be protected. And it goes back to the issue around whistleblowing. Does this perception allow corruption in less suspected institutions to go unnoticed? Yes, I think we see corruption across the board in multiple sectors, but in many cases, the corruption is allowed to go on for years because of lack of scrutiny. And this would be true in the example of the National Lotteries Commission, where there's never been a definitive investigation where people have been charged, but the allegations around that corruption have been going on for years. I've spoken about this notion of the distinction between petty and grand corruption. I think I've also spoken about this notion of endemic corruption and the notion of a kleptocracy. And a kleptocracy is this idea that the state, the entire foundation of the state has become linked to corruption. It's become kleptocratic. It's become captured. And you'll notice this discourse of kleptocracy and fighting kleptocracy beginning to come into some of the international anti-corruption discourse. I noticed that it's something that the Biden administration in the US has started to use in terms of how they're thinking about approaching fighting corruption internationally. And then I've spoken about the challenges around whistleblowing and whistleblower protection. So the effects of corruption, it leads to more poverty. It leads to greater inequality. I think it arguably leads to economic decline, deprivation, and a form of kind of moral decay. In terms of the economic decline, there is clearly a motivating factor for governments to be able to say to the international community that they take the fight against corruption seriously. And this relates to the notion of kind of international investments, the fact that we have a global economy where there's a lot of competition, where countries and companies can place their businesses in multiple jurisdictions. And if they're going to do that, they're going to want to know that there is that corruption and the fight against corruption is taken seriously. I think as you see, as international investment moves away from that notion of confidence, then you do see that investment leaving the country, and that can lead to serious economic consequences. In terms of poverty, corruption is often spoken about as a victimless crime. I think this clearly isn't the case. Resources that are stolen are those that were intended for the use and the benefit of the most vulnerable communities. I've given the example of sanitation and school toilets. As a result, resources do not reach the people that need them, and development is further slowed. This perpetuates human rights violations, such as the lack of access to clean water and basic educations. If you look at many countries across the continent, it's true for South Africa, you'll see that adequate or at least sufficient budgets have been put in place to deal with the basic needs that government is meant to provide around issues such as the right to education. So the budget's there, the resources are there, but yet we're not seeing outcomes as a direct outcome. We're not seeing positive outcomes as a direct result of those commitments around spending. And for me, that's directly related to how corruption kind of erodes the provision of resources to the provision of basic needs. This to me is this direct link, particularly around issues of socioeconomic rights and corruption. Unfair deprivation, corruption robs others of access to opportunity. Deserving candidates get denied opportunities where nepotism and cronyism exists. Those who cannot afford to pay bribes or choose not to pay bribes are deprived of opportunities and entitlements. And the threat of deprivation sometimes compels hesitant people to engage in, sorry, this isn't right. This says the threat of deprivation compels hesitant people to engage in corruption. Okay, yeah, this notion that, you know, I'm gonna pay the traffic cop in order to get out of this fine, you know, because of, you know, I'm worried about what could happen to me. Moral decay. Again, you know, I venture into the area of morality with caution. Being a lawyer, we're more comfortable talking about issues of ethics. But I think, you know, this, in some ways, this is a faith-based community. And I think we can talk about morality. Corruption breeds feelings of hopelessness and despair, which can in turn lower society's willingness to act against corruption. Over time, the culture of corruption can become entrenched. This makes it hard for one to succeed without engaging in corrupt activities. At least there's that strong perception. And the culture of corruption commodifies the rights of people, where one is entitled to receive their license within a reasonable period, but are told that they will have to pay a bribe for the speedy processing of their application. Thus, corruption can lead to this kind of social decay, this kind of unwinding of the sort of social fabric, the moral fabric of a society, and it makes this notion of social compacting very difficult because of the fundamental lack of trust. And, you know, certainly as somebody with young kids as well, you worry about the future, you know, and you worry about what the next generation will inherit if the system continues as it does. Conditions that enable corruption, and I am moving into the last part of the presentation. Secrecy, silence, intimidation, weak policies, lack of enforcement, lack of ethical standards. So corruption thrives in conditions of secrecy. The tendency to conduct meetings in secret or unofficial locations is inherently suspect. A lack of adequate record keeping may allow irregular activities to go unnoticed, makes it very difficult to monitor. And the failure to declare one's assets, conflicts of interest, increases the risk of corruption within an organization. So this is this kind of notion of declarations. If you were to kind of declare your connections with different people, it then would link at least the perceptions, the appearance of corruption. And, you know, we'll talk about solutions, but, you know, what's ultimately linked to this notion of what's the opposite of secrecy in our context is the notion of transparency, but I'll get there. Intimidation, those who do not engage in corrupt activities often feel intimidated by their superiors and are ultimately coerced into participating in corrupt activities. Subordinates may feel too intimidated to question, challenge, or report those engaging in corruption. And the lack of protection of whistleblowers may discourage one from opposing corruption, as it may put them in risk. So, you know, this notion of the kind of intimidating environment. On the second bullet, this notion of subordinates, it was a key finding of the Special Investigating Unit's report into PPE corruption, that there were multiple officials down the line who were complicit in the procurement irregularities that took place by either remaining silent or looking the other way. So these were people that were not directly involved in the corruption, but were indirectly involved by kind of being complicit. We talk here about weak policies, about the lack of enforcement of policies, and then the notion of weak institutions. In many instances, existing laws are insufficient to address corruption vulnerabilities. In other instances, the laws are fine, but they're not properly implemented. This is a great South African sickness, is that we often have fantastic laws and policies, a great constitution, but the issues are around sort of realizing those laws in terms of how they're implemented. In other jurisdictions, the policies are sufficient around governance, but there's a lack of capacity to enforce them. This allows corrupt leaders to get away with their behavior. The lack of policy enforcement diminishes the public's confidence in the law, thus diminishing the law's normative influences. So there's sort of a lot going on. I could have probably unpacked this further, but you really need to have a kind of case-by-case example. It's clear that the state capture project in South Africa was fundamentally about weakening institutions of state to be able to effectively do what they needed to do to uphold the rule of law. And this related specifically to the police and to the prosecution services. The promotion of active citizenry. Many members of our society are not informed or have apathy or just are not completely aware of their rights. We do see that this can be abused by traditional leadership. Corruption Watch has done a lot of work around corruption in the mining sector and how this impacts on mining affected communities, the notion of kind of the resource curse, this notion that in some of the communities where the most valuable precious and semi-precious metals and resources exist, we find some of the poorest communities. And this is because citizens are deactivated, and there's collusion between how the flows of those resources which are meant to benefit the communities are diverted by others in the value chain. In some cases, people are misinformed or don't receive adequate information or training. This is now training in relationship to public officials. Others are oblivious and do not demonstrate active citizenry. These are some of the conditions which allow corruption to thrive. This is an interesting concept. It's critical to the Corruption Watch model that if we can create a more active, engaged, and well-informed citizenry, then we can move further forward faster in our fight against corruption. So this kind of notion of a total society response to corruption, a pillar of that is building active citizens. Corruption trends in Africa, I'm not going to speak about this in great detail, but again, just to note the Corruption Perception Index that Transparency International produces annually. If you look at some of these countries and these scores, you'll see that the lighter, in the index, you see at the bottom, the lighter yellow is seen to be on the more less corrupt side, and the darker orange is in the more highly corrupt side, and then the other colors in the middle are kind of moderately corrupt. So you saw Angola, you see Sudan, you see other countries in the Central African area where perceptions of corruption are extremely high. For some reason, the Western Sahara doesn't get a score there. In terms of foreign states implicated in bribery in Africa, we just saw from the fish rot scandal jurisdictions such as Norway and others, but you'll see many different countries over the years have been implicated in different corruption scandals in South Africa, from the French to the US, the UK, Australia, and others. Some of this is active participation in corruption, the collusion with the role that the banks have played in laundering money. But you don't have to scratch too deep to find different corruption scandals linked and linking some of these other jurisdictions. Sub-Saharan African public sector, by perception at least, remains one of the most corrupt regions in the world. younger rather than older people are more likely to engage in bribery, at least as the perceptions are. Poorer rather than richer people are more likely to engage in bribery. I'm not sure that I agree with that, but that's a finding that had come out in a report. 2/3 of people fear that they will face retaliation if they report corruption. Anti-corruption efforts are increasing in different areas of the continent. There's broad recognition and sign-on to the African Union Convention Against Corruption and the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And we see a majority of people believe that they can make a difference in the fight against corruption. So, there is some tension here in some of these findings, and I think it can be contested. Some of these findings can be debated. Corrupt practices are deeply intertwined with ongoing conflicts and state fragility in some African countries, notably in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel region, and in the DRC. This was from the 2020 U4 Help Desk report from Transparency International. I think it's also worth noting that in various conflict zones where you have drug smuggling, where you have illicit arms smuggling, that oftentimes a lot of those activities have a close link to other kinds of corrupt activities and money laundering. So when you do see conflict situations, you will see some of the other corruption challenges that I've identified. Kenya's ranking was 124 out of 180 countries. Bribery and nepotism were seen as the most common there. There's been a historical issue in Kenya around its anti-corruption commission. Once upon a time, Kenya had a very active and strong anti-corruption commission. I do think that there also is an active civil society in Kenya. And I think, in the South African context, we often look to Kenya. It's often a country which is ahead of South Africa when it comes to other kinds of law reform initiatives. Nigeria has often been spoken about as one of the most corrupt countries in the world, but certainly in Africa, also a country that's been plagued by the resource curse due to oil and mining, significant vote rigging, significant nepotism and cronyism, lots of procurement fraud, many politicians holding shares in the state-owned petroleum company. So, there's lots of challenges there. Ghana has a score which is a bit better than many others. Nevertheless, bribery is still identified as a common challenge. Civil society has been active in Ghana in criticizing the legislative framework, and there has been some developments around whistleblower protection in Ghana. So, I would have liked to have developed this section of the presentation a bit more. I've never given a presentation exactly like this, but I do think this would be an interesting area to engage participants on, to understand, your experience of corruption in your countries. Just moving now to something that's a bit more optimistic. It's been a little bit negative, the presentation, to talk about some of the solutions. So, the flip side, as I mentioned, to secrecy is the notion of transparency. The flip side to the notion of intimidation is our notions around protection and accountability, weak policies and enforcement. We talk about upholding the rule of law. And in terms of lack of understanding or lack of awareness, we talk about advocacy and public education. Organizations must be upfront and visible about the actions that they take. They must develop minimum standards for ethical procurement, improve transparency in the funding of political parties. This is something which we've made some progress on recently in South Africa, the money that flows into politics and being able to monitor that. The need to develop risk management frameworks to guide the assessment of vulnerable sectors. This is vulnerable sectors within the economy, An example would be infrastructure and infrastructure development, enhancing business integrity, such as the promotion of integrity pacts amongst those who bid for government contracts, and then improving systems for the capturing and analysis of intelligence and data. All of those are issues which can help improve transparency. This other notion that we've been promoting is a notion of open contracting in the procurement context, so we can know exactly who gets contracts, for what value, and under what conditions. We talk about the establishment of integrated digital financial and procurement management systems. And this again is this notion of open contracting, and I'll point you to the work of the Open Contracting Partnership. Also the notion of developing beneficial ownership transparency. Beneficial ownership relates to the notion of the fact that we don't always know who's behind a company. Sometimes there's fronting that takes place, or that certain people are put forth as being the face of a company or corporation, when in fact there are others who receive the benefit of that. That's where a lot of secrecy takes place, and the promotion of beneficial ownership is an international trend to help try to close up that challenge. Accountability, again, is a key watchword. The obligation or willingness to accept responsibility and to be answerable for one's actions. The media and civil society can play a key role in, I don't know if they can play a key role in holding leaders accountable, but they can play a key role in pushing for accountability. I think ultimately the accountability that we look for is accountability within the criminal justice system, so that prosecutions take place and where possible assets that are unlawfully received are recovered. This also then relates to notions of whistleblower enhancement, protecting and incentivizing whistleblowers, and developing a culture around reporting corruption. Another key aspect is reforms around the appointment process of public officials. We find that within the South African Constitution, the president and the executive is given significant power around the appointment of senior officials into key positions across the public sector. For those who drafted the Constitution, they have clearly, they've put their hand up and they've said, we didn't realize that giving the presidency those kinds of powers could lead to irregular appointments and therefore corruption within the system. I think there was an assumption that the executive would make appointments based upon notions of meritocracy and the best people for the job. But we've seen that appointment processes have often been upturned in order to then hijack and capture different government agencies. We talk about the need for competency assessments for public officials, and then oversight over their direct appointment. The other, over their direct performance. The other key issue to raise here is the notion of probity. So the notion that key officials in key areas where there are corruption vulnerabilities, such as those responsible for procurement, would then have a heightened level of scrutiny around their conduct by being able to look into their bank accounts and being able to kind of assess their issues that go into their privacy. And again, I've alluded to the possibility of the need to possibly sacrifice some of our rights around privacy in order to ensure that we enhance our fight against corruption. The rule of law and stronger policies. We talk about the need to have a durable system of laws, to have durable institutions and norms that can deliver accountability, holding government as well as private sectors accountable under the law. The practical difficulties are when these key institutions get captured, ensuring that laws are clear and publicized and that they're not sort of frequently changed, that we strengthen constitutional and other oversight bodies, that we strengthen whistleblower protection. I've spoken about the notion of unexplained wealth orders, ratification and implementation of anti-corruption conventions, such as the AU Convention and the UN Convention. And then, okay, there's duplications on this slide around whistleblowing, but you can see whistleblower protection is a big part of what we feel needs to happen. Public education, we've spoken about, the notion of anti-corruption campaigns at schools, anti-corruption campaigns within the public sector, specialization and training of professionals within the government, embedding anti-corruption practice within government departments and institutions. Okay, this is a duplicate. Okay. Now, just as I move to kind of some of the concluding slides, I just wanted to speak a little bit about the case study of the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. Going back to 2016, the then public protector Thuli Madonsela issued a set of recommendations relating to an investigation she did relating to the capture of key state institutions and the roles that private individuals played in this, notably a family from India that came into South Africa called the Guptas. There was quite a bit of back and forth with the then President Zuma around the implementation of these recommendations, which ultimately led to a ruling of the Constitutional Court that compelled the president to establish a judicial commission of inquiry into state capture, which was then launched in 2018 to investigate allegations of state capture, corruption, fraud, and other allegations. This commission has been chaired by the Deputy Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, Raymond Zondo, and has been going on for 3 years. It's currently in the process of winding down, and we anxiously await the report of the commission, which should have wide-ranging findings and recommendations. The commission's interviewed hundreds of witnesses and collected hundreds of thousands of pieces of evidence. There have been very senior officials who provided testimony, including President Ramaphosa and various sitting ministers and former ministers. It's important to note that President Zuma, former President Zuma, attended the commission and then left, and was then refused to return to the commission, which then led to a contempt of court charge and ultimately a criminal charge against him, which led to his being incarcerated in prison because of his failure to go before the Zondo Commission. It's important to note that there are some real challenges around the role that a commission of inquiry can play as a kind of providing a kind of permanent institutional response. And particularly this challenge around sort of what happens to the investigations which have taken place under the banner of the commission. And there have been some thought given to this, which is now allowed for a kind of closer nexus between the work of the commission and ultimately the work to come from the police and the National Prosecuting Authority to use the evidence from the investigations in criminal prosecutions that may come down the line. The commission's heard evidence on a variety of issues. There've been, this real kind of detailed study of the role that the Guptas have played in perverting many state institutions. I've noted the role that consultants and other facilitators have played, notably McKinsey, who agreed to pay back a significant amount of money, maladministration and corruption in various state-owned enterprises, notably Eskom, Transnet, the SABC and Denel, and then, as noted previously, the corruption in the Free State, which has now been the source of prosecutions implicating the Secretary General of the governing party in South Africa. Just briefly to note on the role that anti-corruption agencies play, their role is primarily an investigative role. They can prosecute in the case of the National Prosecuting Authority. They can try to seize and recover stolen assets, or I've noted the challenges around that. They can engage in monitoring and certain types of intelligence functions. And then they can also assist in helping to develop new policies by identifying the vulnerabilities which exist within the current system. The key agencies in South Africa have come together to form something called the Fusion Center. So there's extreme cooperation taking place now between these different bodies. The MPA, the police, the Revenue Service, the Financial Intelligence Center, should include in here the Special Investigating Unit, a key body that should be included in this slide. The United Nations Convention Against Corruption envisions the notion that countries who sign on to that convention will establish a central, independent anti-corruption agency. Now, for many in civil society, the establishment of a dedicated anti-corruption agency is still the right way to go when it comes to fighting corruption. South Africa's gone for what it calls a multi-agency approach and seeks to justify this approach on the basis that the specialized mandates assist in developing expertise, and that we can also foreclose the possibility of future capture by having multiple agencies involved in the process. I think that doesn't really fly, and that's sort of been used as an excuse for South Africa to take much bolder steps when it comes to its institutional response to the fight against corruption. Just noting some of the instruments and the International Anti-Corruption Framework. I've spoken about the UN Convention. We've spoken about the AU Convention. There are other pieces of kind of what we call soft law in terms of the African Charter, the African Union Advisory Board on Corruption. We've spoken about the role that Transparency International can play. There are other kinds of regional protocols that we see in Africa related to the various regions, ECOWAS and SADC. And then there are other kinds of initiatives such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative in the mining industry, the coming together of different supreme audit institutions. In South Africa, we have the Auditor General. There's something called the Afrobarometer. Important international body is the Financial Action Task Force that does reviews of different countries and issues recommendations. And then the countering of transnational crimes. The role of civil society is varied, as long as a piece of string. I think we have to be honest that one of the real challenges civil society has is that we dependent upon philanthropic funding in order to do what we do. But I would suggest that Corruption Watch and the approach that Corruption Watch has taken is an example or a model of how a civil society organization can get involved. Part of this is around modeling good governance, the different types of promotion of awareness campaigns, ensuring that corruption is reported, the monitoring of what government does, and then the different types of research and advocacy work that we do in terms of issuing reports. And also, I think the key work that we do in terms of media engagements. And a lot of what I do requires giving media comment on different issues, corruption issues as they emerge. Modeling good governance, I don't want to speak a lot about this, but it's around implementing principles of good governance and transparency within our organization. In terms of promoting awareness campaigns, I think this is a big, again, it depends how free and open and democratic our societies are. Do we live in societies which allow us to march and to protest? But I think awareness campaigns can be a big part of what we do. the reporting of corruption. And I'm moving a little bit quickly through these final slides because my voice is getting a little bit tired. I would have liked to have had a co-presenter to give me a break, but I think we can discuss some of these issues. But I've spoken about the important requirement to report corruption. Reporting incidents of corruption can help ensure accountability. There is always an issue around anonymity, anonymous reporting. Certainly anonymous reporting is acceptable. It can protect the identity of whistleblowers. It can also be more challenging when you don't know the identity of the people that are raising complaints, and therefore you're not able to go back to them to seek in some cases, you're not able to go back to them to seek clarification or to kind of understand how they understand the issues. There's sometimes reports are made on the basis of hearsay or on the basis of conjecture or sort of not a real understanding of the situation. In many cases, whistleblowers come forth without the ability of being able to provide hard evidence. And then in those cases, it's not always easy to take forward investigations. I think research and advocacy is critical. Advocacy relates to the campaigns we spoke about earlier, but this is certainly a big part of what Corruption Watch does. Proposals around strengthening the law, doing a trend analysis, where do we see corruption? In some cases, engaging in strategic litigation, which is something which we do. And then, the making of various submissions. We've done a lot of reporting in the mining sector. We've made submissions to the Zondo Commission. We participate in various anti-corruption fora. And then the types of advocacy and submissions we've made around appointments. There are other specific tools that we've developed to help monitor corruption. We've developed a tool that promotes transparency in policing, which is called the VESA tool. We're in the process of developing another tool in the area of procurement to analyze the information which is submitted by National Treasury on a quarterly basis. And these are tools ultimately which the public should also be able to use. And I'll point you to our website to have a look at those and to understand them a bit better. The Procurement Watch tool is still in development and will be launched later this year. The way forward, I think it's important that corruption, it's like death in taxes. It's sort of been with us from the beginning. So we're not going to eradicate it quickly or completely. The fight against corruption is relentless. It requires resilience. It requires patience and collaboration amongst key role players, including civil society, including whistleblowers, including the media, and including those within the state, within law enforcement who we feel we can trust. There's a legal and constitutional obligation upon the state to do everything in its power to root out corruption. And this is linked to the obligation to realize fundamental rights. And individuals, private individuals, communities ultimately have a key role to play in resisting the culture of corruption. There's a need for incremental change that's sensitive to the context in which we find ourselves, but in other cases, there's the need for sort of more systemic change. I think it's important to note, and I think Mike said this in the introduction, that corruption is not exceptional. Corruption is not a South African problem. It's not a Southern African problem. It's not an African problem or a developing world problem. It's in some cases, it's become normalized, and we see it in every jurisdiction every jurisdiction around the world. So it's actually the fight against corruption and the eradication of corruption, which ultimately will be something which is exceptional and will be special, and is something that, despite a kind of critical analysis, is something that we can't sort of lose faith in, and is something that we need to sort of continue to be committed to in order to sort of see the progress and the development that that we want, particularly for the society that we seek to pass on to the next generation. So that was a mouthful, and I think that's a good place for me to stop just around 1 o'clock. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Karam, very much indeed. And I can hear your voices taking a little bit of strain, but what a very comprehensive and thorough and magnificent overview you've given us of this problem. This really is going to be an excellent resource for us and for my colleagues in other African countries, this presentation. So thank you very much indeed.